The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Western democratic nations used to be so confident in the rightness of their forms of government that promoting and exporting democracy worldwide was a top foreign policy priority. Tonight, as part of our joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, The Democracy Agenda, we'll examine whatever happened to that enthusiasm. Then we'll take a closer look at Western democracies and whether populism and growing strains of authoritarian rule reflect typical growing pains or signal deeper trouble. It's Thursday, February 18th, and that's tonight on The Democracy Agenda. If Western democratic countries once were accused of hubris as they claimed victory for democracy in the post-Cold War era, today such outspoken fervor and the impulse to export democracy, well, it's now greatly diminished. With us now, as part of our joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, The Democracy Agenda, we welcome, in Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And in the provincial capital, in Riverside, Chad Rogers, Founding Partner at the Public Affairs Agency Crestview Strategy. On the Danforth, Lucan Way, Professor of Political Science at the U of T's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And in Midtown, there's Martin Redcon, political columnist with the Toronto Star. And we welcome everybody back to our program. Martin, I got to say, we're really enjoying this initiative with the Star, so glad you could join us for this, our third episode of our Democracy Agenda. We want to just share with you and our viewers some numbers here off the top. The Economist magazine, they do an annual survey called the Democracy Index just to see who's moving closer towards the ideals of democracy, who's moving further away. Sheldon, if you would, let's put these numbers up and we'll share these with everybody here. Full-fledged, let's call them Canadian-style democracies, if you like. No question about the amount of democracy we have in Canada today. We are considered one of the world's stronger democracies, but that's only 8.4% of the people in this world who live under such conditions. In so-called flawed democracies, there's another 41% of the world's population. So-called hybrid regimes, 15%. And then at the bottom of the list, authoritarian regimes. These would be the ones the furthest away in this world from democracy, more than a third of the world's population living under those conditions. If you do the math, it's just about 50-50 on the nose between those living under some form of democracy and those who don't. Now, the average global score in the 2020 Democracy Index fell from 5.44 in 2019 to 5.37 in 2020. It's just a way of measuring, and it's by far the worst global score since the index was first produced in 2006. And again, I felt somewhat confident calling Canada a full democracy off the top. We came fifth on the Economist's scale. The United States, incidentally, 25th. Okay, lots of numbers there to chew over. Lucan, why don't you put that into some historical context for us off the top?
Well, a couple of things are interesting. One, it's important to note where this decline has occurred. Now, typically we would assume that the decline would be among newer democracies that are presumably less consolidated. But in fact, most of the decline has occurred among established democracies like the United States. And in fact, in the developing world, among newer democracies, the number of democracies in the last 10 or 15 years has remained remarkably stable. So that, democracy has survived in a number of places with, very inhospitable conditions, extreme poverty, weak institutions, ethnic polarization. And overall, there's only been a decline of about 5 or 6% in the last 10 or 15 years. And we are still very much in an era where there is more democracy now than there ever has been in world history. Maybe since 2006 it's been declined, but since 1972 there's been a dramatic increase, and the small decline that has occurred recently has not hit into that.
As I asked Besma to follow up on that, I would say some days it doesn't feel that way. For example, countries move back and forth on this Economist Index. And India, for example, apparently less democratic over the past year. Taiwan, on the other hand, considered more democratic. What's your read on the state of democracy in the world today?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, look, it's been a 20-year process, maybe 15 to 20-year process where we're seeing not just the decline of democracy, but as the stats show, sort of a rise of authoritarianism in these hybrid regimes. The state of affairs is quite sad. Of course, coming out of the Trump era, I mean, we see it next door, this polarization, disinformation. There's a lot of blame, frankly, on information communication technology and social media, the digital authoritarianism of a lot of governments who are able to not just monitor their people, which is really, I think, quite perverse and quite worrying, but also to clamp down on their people, whether it's self-censorship or write-out censorship. And of course, media, which so many of you are so interested in, of course, is really taking a beating globally. And this is really quite sad. And of course, India is a great example of that. I mean, it has a history of a wonderful media that had historically been so critical of government and powerful people, but it's been silenced under Modi. So it's really quite troubling.
Now, Chad, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the program today is that you spend, if you want to call it, some of your spare time supporting pro-democracy movements in places like Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. I do have to point out that the Russian president has said liberal democracy, as we understand it today, is quote unquote obsolete. When you see some of the results, the likes of which we've just presented, do you worry that he's right?
No, I'd expect nothing more from a thug who looks at the basics of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the core ingredients of free press, judiciary, free and fair, elections, right to assemble, as meaningless and secondary to his own interests. I had the pleasure of working for something called the National Democratic Institute for a number of years, where we'd go out and actually support democracy activists as they made the transition. And if there was one humbling thing as a Canadian going abroad and doing that work, it was how much of my own history I regarded democracy as a one-way turnstile, that it's something you earn once or you achieve once. And the humility about the weakness in our own system as you look at transitional democracies is remembering that democracy is imperfect and unfinished by design. And in Canada, the number I always take into account, and I use it, when I'm with friends and family, which is 1957. And it's not just the year that Diefenbaker wins a surprise federal election in Canada. It's the first time we let our fellow citizens, Indigenous citizens, participate in an election and vote. There is no perfection in democracy. It is a constant, slow revolution of making it better. So we can't conflate the constant effort to make democracies better when they stumble with the effort of being democratic or not.
Now, some people as well, Martin, are going to wonder, why are we having the Ontario politics correspondent for the Toronto Star on this program? But I think we only need to read your Twitter account description of yourself to understand that you are a self-described recovering foreign correspondent. You've traveled all over the world. You've lived in many places around the world. How do you explain what has come to be known as a bit of a democratic recession over the last 15 years?
Well, I think we have to question the premise, too. I agree with what Besma and Chad were saying, and also looking about how is the glass half full or half empty. And I think we have to remember that to use the economist terminology, flawed democracies, every democracy is flawed and is a work in progress. I think that was Chad's point. Certainly our own, certainly America's. They're not just flawed, it's also not a linear progression. And every democracy takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some, talk about a recession in democracy. And I think that's an apt term, because think of it as the business cycle. You have the pendulum swinging, you have an economic surge and a crash, and democracy works in much the same ways. Think of the election cycle. Democracy is not just elections, but the pendulum shows us that sometimes you have these unpleasant lurches towards authoritarian populism, and then you have corrections and corrective forces. So let's not get too down on the downturn. One other point, I think it was Lucan's point, one of the reasons we're having these setbacks is we had this incredible surge, this blossoming in democracy, starting with, not just starting, but epitomized by the fall of the Berlin Wall, and prosperity in East Asia, which gave us Taiwan and South Korean democracy, some of the most robust. So the fall of the Soviet Empire gave us democracy, embryonic democracy in Poland and Ukraine, Hungary. So all these countries that are having some setbacks in the last few years, like Hungary and Poland in particular, and I was just in Poland a few years ago. Let's remember how far Poland and Hungary and Romania have come in the last 15 years. So there's going to be blowback, and then there's going to be recovery.
Well, as we look around the world, Lucan, we do have to say that even though there was a coup in Myanmar, there are people in the streets demonstrating against that. Even though Vladimir Putin tried to poison, well, I shouldn't say categorically, but it's certainly the evidence, the preponderance of evidence would suggest that he tried to take out his the leader of the opposition, Alexei Navalny, with poison. You've got people in the streets protesting on his behalf. You've got youth in Hong Kong showing remarkable attachment to the vestiges of democracy there. Even though democracy may be this year on a downward slant, is it fair to say, in your judgment, that it's still the desired model for governance in much of the world?
Absolutely. Look, in 1972, there were 3 times more autocracies than democracies. Now it's about even. And furthermore, despite the discreditation of the West, despite the fact that, in the 1990s, the West was wealth, prosperity, democracy, with the financial crisis that's gone out the window, but competitive elections remain incredibly popular. People may not abide by all elements of liberalism, tolerance and the like, but people like to be able to throw out bad governments in elections. So thus, as you said, there's been a wave of protests in support of democracy across the world: Algeria, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Russia, Belarus, you name it. Democracy remains very popular.
Now, as encouraging as that sounds, I'm going to bring one of our Middle East experts in here right now, in Besma Momani, to talk about the fact that a decade ago, the Arab Spring sprung, and there was tremendous excitement and optimism in the air. And Besma, I think you'd have to conclude a decade later, a lot of those dreams for a more democratic Middle East are simply dead. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think the desire is still there, but certainly in terms of government repression, able to basically, clamp down and ensure that those democratic movements are no more is absolutely the case. And that's really unfortunate. But I think it really is, just as, many of the colleagues on this panel are pointing out, there's a global challenge. And I think that means that we have to think about what are the structural features of this. Is it, as I said before, the increased use of the internet and having more social media platforms that are channeling us into these echo chambers and so hardening views. I think the structural economic issues is something that we should think about, whether it's the international financial crisis, inequality, right? This is something that I think is a real part of the threatening aspects of democracy being challenged, is the fact that people don't feel like things are getting better on the economic side. It really is part of what explained the rise of Donald Trump and so many of these populist authoritarians. So I think there are some sort of global structural features that explain why we're seeing this. And I don't think it's just the Middle East. Yeah,
Chad, democracy in some respects is a short form for liberal democracy, the respect for civil rights, free and fair elections, a judiciary, rule of law, and so on and so forth. I wonder if I could get you to speak to the issue about whether there are people around this world who are less offended at the democracy part of that equation and more offended at the notion that somehow they've got to do it, quote unquote, in a liberal way. Is that part of the problem here?
It's an extremely interesting question. I mean, what you're often confronted with in societies in transition is who wins and who loses. And there's often an entrenched elite who are very big winners, to whom small L liberalism is terrifying because it means they get less of what they're currently keeping for themselves. You look at the magic ingredients for when democracies work and have their blossoming moments. It's not just a great protest or one singular election. It is, are there nascent institutions that have the basis to build and enforce those big 5 norms we talk about in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, shepherded by a New Brunswicker of all people, Dr. John Humphreys. There's the second side of the triangle, which is civil society. Do we have community, religious, other social structures outside of the state that can aggregate public opinion? And then do we have the political actors who are free to speak and engage and aggregate social opinion? And when we have these false starts, pure democracy versus the liberal tinge of it, there's a moment in the last few years, as we've talked about the rise of populism and political correctness and all of the debates we're having about social change and broadening the franchise. And I think it's a stolen quote, or it's falsely attributed to Thoreau, which is, if you hold 99% of the power and you lose 1%, that feels like oppression to you. Remember that at these big democratic moments, there are people who lose a lot instantly as you broaden the franchise. And sometimes it's an elite being deposed in Romania and then hung out the windows. How about in North America, when we have a whole bunch of people joining a debate right now because they have social media tools who some of us regard as uninformed? But that's always been the debate when we make the franchise bigger. Some people feel like they're losing a little bit of what they used to be the gatekeeper of.
Martin, I wonder if I could get you to amplify on that from this standpoint. There are places in this world which have fewer objections to the notion of free and fair elections, that part of the democratic equation. But they're not going to give up the notion of religion having an absolutely central part of the story of their country and in the daily life of their country. They are not signing on for gay rights and that kind of thing. These are the parts of the equation they're not going to be a part of, and yet they still want to be thought of as democracies. Discuss.
Well, absolutely. I spent 11 years abroad, and most of that time was actually covering not so much conflict, but faith and religion and faith and politics. If you want a refresher course on the importance of that and how connected they are, think of our friends to the south. For better or for worse, faith and religion are huge parts of American politics, certainly the anti-abortion drive with the Republican Party. But remember, if you think about the setbacks, let's say in Poland right now, a lot of people are focusing on the loss of abortion rights. I couldn't be more pro-choice, but I understand that that's not necessarily an indicator of pure democracy, because look at Ireland. We think of Ireland as a robust democracy, but they banned abortion for decades. Italy took its time. So you can't pick and choose. Democracy is a process, and it doesn't have one particular look. There are many democracies in Africa and the Caribbean, some of which are quite healthy, which are very retrograde on gay rights. So you can't necessarily pick and cherry pick which are the problem areas. You mentioned the Middle East a moment ago. I spent 4 years living in the Middle East, and I've just been to Iran and Egypt, Lebanon in the last 3 or 4 years. These are countries that are hurting in every way, but certainly democratically. Egypt, Lebanon has a kind of democracy, a phantom democracy, but it is hijacked by various factions, religion playing a huge part there. But here's the point I want to make. People in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, who have not had an election since 2005, 15 years ago, despite purporting to be democratic, they are inspired by a model, not necessarily the optimal model, but perhaps inspiration is a wrong word that will offend some people, but they see democracy in action every day next door on their television screens in Israel. Israel is an occupying force about whom they are deeply, to whom they feel great antipathy and everything else. But one of the reasons they want democracy is that they have been exposed to it every day in Israel, where they have 2 or 3 elections a year in a bad year. So people want democracy. Chinese on the mainland see what's happening in Taiwan, and they want democracy. One of the reasons they're snuffing out democracy in Hong Kong is the fear that it will be a virus that is a contagion in the mainland. So there is still that desire to look for models. The models can be flawed, as it is in America. People can still aspire for the process of democracy with all the good, the bad, and the ugly.
You mentioned America, and I want to pick up there with Lucan. There's a new team in the Oval Office now, Lucan, and well, they're different from the old team. The old team didn't seem to have too much of a problem with increasing authoritarianism in various parts of the world. I wonder whether you think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris intend to be more robust in their pursuit of a more liberal international order.
Well, it wouldn't be hard, given the fact that you had a president who actively embraced autocrats and favored them over democratic leaders. And I think there will definitely, especially in terms of rhetoric, be a shift in terms of actively trying to promote democracy in various countries. But there are clear limits. I mean, there's obviously a lot of stuff on Biden's plate, global warming, obviously COVID, that require him to work with autocrats. So I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be too optimistic in terms of how far he's willing to go. But I do think this change in rhetoric, can have a huge impact on the margins.
Besma, how about you on that same question?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, certainly we've seen a total change in rhetoric coming out of the White House. And I think Biden's going to be a more introverted president. I don't think you're going to get a lot, despite the rhetoric that we've seen already and some very good kind of signs to rejoin the multilateral framework. I don't think you're going to get a very active president. And frankly, I think, this is not a time to be talking about sort of fixing the world when they need to fix what's happening at home. The United States is broken. It's polarized. You have racial challenges all day, the inequity, economic disparities, talking about trying to find a new path forward for economic growth. I mean, there are so many challenges at home for Biden to fix. I just don't think they have the moral high ground to sort of be talking about trying to fix the world. So it's going to be an introverted presidency, and that's a good thing because they've got a lot to do at home. And at the same time, frankly, globally, their past record, when you talk about democracy promotion, you can't help but George Bush and sort of what he did with Iraq to think that, somehow they're in a position to spread this wonderful thing. They just don't hold the mantle anymore. And I don't think there's an appetite for it globally to hear from the United States leader that they're going to come with this great, concept of democracy. It's just not the same world that we had, 20 years ago.
Well, Chad, let me follow up with you from this angle. Even though the United States, as everybody here has said, was not a perfect practitioner of democracy, let's say 25, let's say 50 years ago, I think there was less doubt than there is today about what the idea of America represented in the world. And that if at least it paid lip service to the export of democracy, it became incumbent upon those who didn't want democracy and who wanted to treat their populations worse, that they might have to watch out for what the U.S. intended to do about that. Do you think the Biden administration wants to get back to a time where that kind of thinking was prevalent in the world?
Absolutely. The United States, for any of its failings, Yuval Levin has a great book called Fractured Republic I'd recommend, and he has a beautiful opening paragraph. And I'm going to steal a line from it where he says, when we talk about these great successes and failures, we forget they're often happening at the same time. And he summarizes it by saying, in democracies in countries like ours, renewal chases ruin. When the United States fails, it dramatically improves immediately after. That speaks to how functional it is as a democracy. And yes, Iraq as a war was folly with an incredible cost, but Iraq today has a parliament. Iraq today doesn't have a totalitarian dictator who enslaves 1/3 of his country and tortures those who disagree with him. That doesn't exist. They have a multi-partisan system. It is not perfect. It is in transition, but it is better than what preceded it. And the United States consistently puts the greatest share of its GDP of any Western nation on the earth on the table to enforce democracy and other institutions like free judiciaries and free media and others. I had the opportunity when I worked for the National Democratic Institute to serve a woman who used to be Secretary of State named Madeleine Albright and work with 3,000 colleagues in 60 countries around the world. We had a sister institute headed by the late John McCain. They did the same. So for all of the failings of the United States, where they are not always the best example, they certainly put more money on the table and more capital in helping those who want better democracy, better judiciary, better media, more freedom around the world than any other nation. So they'll be the leaders of the debate so long as they're the people financing it to the greatest extent.
Martin, I know everybody looks to the United States first when it comes to leadership on what we're talking about tonight. But Canada likes to think of itself as having a role to play as well. Do we? And if we do, what is it?
Yeah, we have a role, but we can't exaggerate it. I could give a pep talk about Canadian models. Bob Rae, someone we both know, founded and ran for many years the Forum of the Federations, which tried to share the wisdom and the bruises that we had from our own federalist adventures in countries like Sri Lanka, for example. But it didn't take, and in fact, Sri Lanka deported Bob Rae on the last time he tried to go there, our UN ambassador. So we are a model of when I've traveled to countries from around the world, people have looked at us as a model of multiculturalism, our immigration model, and so on. But we're at the margins. There are other countries that are also models: Sweden, Norway, the Scandinavian countries. But here's the thing, including with American exceptionalism, and I happen to agree with Chad that America, for all its warts, can still be a model by virtue of its scale and its presence. And just because they screwed up doesn't mean it can't, as I argued earlier, doesn't mean it still can't be a model. I mean, smart people understand that democracies are always having crazy zigzags. That doesn't mean you go for the consistency of authoritarianism that you see in China today. It means you have the hullabaloo. But the thing about Canadian and other countries being models is you can't ever export one particular model to any country. I know this sounds perhaps obvious or cliche, but every country is so different. None of it, it's about your social character and your historical development and your economic prosperity. And when you try to graft a particular model onto Uganda or Iraq or Gaza or any other country, you're going to have problems. I mean, the Swedish democracy works for Sweden. And no matter how hard the Toronto Star tried for decades to try to bring the Swedish model to Canada, and Ed Broadbent tried to bring the Swedish model of social democratic unions and management, and the German model, Canada's Canada. We like to be frisky sometimes. We have all our different fights, our social makeup. So that's a mistake. That doesn't mean you can't do God's work, as Chad did for the National Democratic Institute, and try to export the process of democracy, the ugly stuff of organizing and fundraising, because otherwise all these well-meaning Democrats in Egypt and Iraq don't have any power bases. They're up against the mullahs or against the army, and they can't compete. So you need to build it from the ground up. These countries all have shallow roots. All I'm saying is, yes, you can be a model, but no, you can't graft it somewhere else.
Well, you mentioned Bob Rae in that answer, and we actually have a piece of tape we want to play now from Bob Rae's University of Toronto roommate. Everybody remembers who that was, right? Here's the former leader of the Federal Liberal Party, Michael Ignatieff. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
There's a deeper crisis in the liberal confidence in the very stories we tell about our past. In this story, we tell the story that it was technology, that lifted the burden of labor off the backs of men and women. It was medical science that enabled women to face childbirth without terror. It was science that gave us the prospect that everyone could be born, grow up, and live a normal life, that freed millions and then billions from starvation and hunger. This is the Enlightenment story, the wonderful story that we inherit from Bacon, from Newton, from Adam Smith onwards, the empowering relationship between knowledge and freedom. And this is what liberated mankind from servitude, hunger, disease, and premature death. And frankly, it's the only good story left.
The only good story left. Okay, Michael Ignatieff from a speech he gave. In our remaining few moments here, let me get everybody quickly in on this last one, because I'd like to hear from all of you. Do we in the West still believe? Do we still believe enough in the values of freedom of speech and social progress and civil rights and a clean judiciary and free and fair elections to want to export these ideas around the world? Lucan, go.
Well, I think, in some ways you could say, well, the United States has been discredited by the recent election. But I think what this does is it tells us and the world how important these basic, democratic processes are. And, I really don't think we should clump all forms of democracy promotion together just because, things went disastrously in Iraq does not mean that we cannot use other means to promote democracy in the world. Simple naming and shaming, has worked wonders in preventing democratic reversals in places as diverse as Georgia, Ukraine, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Serbia, and the like. And I think that's something that the Biden administration is in a perfect position to do. So, and this doesn't require an investment of a large number of resources, but it still means we can be quite successful in turning the tide in a number of cases.
Esma, do we still believe?
We do, and let's not forget the world still believes, because migration is coming to the West, it's coming to democracy. So, I'm obviously not just a great proponent of democracy, I do believe that we embody it more than anywhere else in the world, and people want it. That's fundamental. But frankly, we can be hypocritical about it, all countries, and that's partly because globalization has made us so dependent on every country. Look at what we're doing today with China, not being able to really stand firm against what may be the genocide against the Uyghur people because of how important it is. France, it talks a big game about this. Macron certainly tries to, but it sells weapons to Egypt and other countries. The Germany as well, it talks a big game. Merkel is a great proponent of democracy, but she makes a deal with the Russians because they need gas, and they make a deal with the Turks because they want to prevent the refugee crisis. So, I think it's easy for as an analyst to see that there's a lot of hypocrisy there. But, in essence, we are still a better system, and I think the world and people want this, but we need to work on ensuring it and nurturing it here at home.
30 to Chad, 30 to MRC.
Yes. And as we've lived through this very imperfect pandemic lockdown, every part of it has encouraged me about small d democracy. We've developed a whole new social license about masks, about distance. The federal government has not had to implement the Emergencies Act yet and deprive us of our liberties. And as we navigate this really imperfect, full of contradictions, goofy response, we're doing it together. We're doing it according to democratic norms. And our leaders are terrifically scared of falling out of line with their citizens. That's democracy.
Last word to the Toronto Star.
Well, I think that's democracy is exactly right, Chad. That just because you have a good process doesn't mean you're going to get a great outcome every time. There are all kinds of examples of democracy giving us bad governments. That doesn't mean we can't still have faith in a system that helps us get rid of those bad governments and give us a transition to power. Just briefly, though, we have to be careful about the rise of authoritarian populism again. But don't lose heart, because it's cyclical. We've had it before and we'll have it again. And the challenge is to try to deal with it and get rid of it over and over again.
I want to thank all four of you for participating in our Democracy Agenda series with the Toronto Star. Martin Redcon, Besma Momani, Lucan Way, Chad Rogers. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Stay safe out there, everybody, and I look forward to talking to you again. Europe has a long and complicated history with democracy, and if there is reason to worry about backsliding in some democratic nations on the continent today, it is not for the first time. What can we learn from that? Sherry Berman's latest book is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Régime to the present day. She is a professor of political science at Columbia University's Barnard College, and she joins us now from New York as part of the joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, the Democracy Agenda. Professor Berman, it's good to meet you. How are you managing through this pandemic?
I'm getting through.
That's the right answer, I think. Yes, indeed. Well, let's just set this up this way. I guess for the last 25 years or so of the 20th century, democracy was really in ascension. It had won the Cold War. It looked like it was the go-to-ism in the world. But the first couple of decades of the 21st century have not been as kind. Orban, Erdogan, Modi, Kaczynski, Duterte, Bolsonaro, and of course in your country, Trump. What is, in your view, the thread that connects all of these challengers to the idea of liberal democracy?
Well, dissatisfaction with democracy is the greatest spur for the rise of autocracy and the rise of illiberal Democrats. So if you look at the countries that you mentioned, places like Turkey, Hungary, the Philippines, and Brazil, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the politicians that existed before the rise of these autocrats and with the functioning of the democratic system more generally. So one way to think about the attractiveness of authoritarians is by looking at, again, the context within which they arise, which is rising dissatisfaction with democracy. So when democracies don't do well, people are open to alternatives. And I think that's the place to start an understanding of the rise of these populists, these authoritarians in many parts of the world today.
Okay, let me follow up with this, because you've written that liberal democracy is, quote, a rare and recent phenomenon. What makes the ingredients in it so rare?
Well, takes an awful lot to make democracy work. It takes an awful lot institutionally. It takes an awful lot normatively. Let's start with the first part, the institutions. Democracy only works well where we have strong, well-functioning political parties committed to the rules of the game, where we have an active and independent civil society, where we have a free press, where we have a business community that is not dependent on the state to prosper, where we have citizens who accept the political equality of all citizens, where we have citizens who accept the legitimacy of opposition. These are not easy things to build. And if we look at the history of the West, that is to say the history of countries where democracy has its longest history, we see very clearly that these take a very, very long time to construct, to embed deeply in societies. And so that many countries that only recently made transitions to democracy in places like, again, the Philippines, Brazil, parts of Eastern Europe, we should not be surprised that they are struggling simply because, again, the institutional and normative infrastructure for democracy is vast and difficult to build.
One of my favorite books of all time about democracy is actually not nonfiction, it's a novel, Advise and Consent by Alan Drury. And one of the lines in the book, which I'm sure, actually David Frum tweeted this the other day, which is what reminded me of it as well. Let's bring this up, Sheldon. Democracy is the most fragile thing on earth. For what does it rest upon? You and me, and the fact that we agree to maintain it. The moment either of us says we will not, that's the end of it. That's from Advise and Consent. What do you think of that?
I think that that's a very apt quote, and I think it's 100% correct, right? Which is democracy is a system that depends on the behavior of citizens and the behavior of elites. And sort of going back to something we just discussed, right? It depends on citizens accepting the rules of the game, accepting the equality, the political equality of their fellow citizens, the legitimacy of opposition, elites playing by the rules of the game. And these are not things that come naturally or easily and can be very easily thrown off balance. I think my own country is an excellent example of that. And recognizing how fragile these things are, I think should give us a greater appreciation of, again, as that quote indicates, how much it takes from average citizens and the elites who run the system, the democratic system, for it to keep working well.
I wonder if through your research you've discovered what the tipping point is. In other words, this percentage of the population has to be this ticked off in this strong a fashion for them finally to basically give up on the notions of democracy you've just been referring to.
Well, I don't think, unfortunately, although it would be very nice, that there's a particular percentage or one particular measure we can use and have that always indicate, okay, look, we're at a tipping point now. Democracy is in real danger. But there are obviously a lot of things we can look at that are warning signs, right? When people, as we've already discussed, when people are willing to support politicians and parties who are clearly not committed to playing by the rules of the game, when anger and resentment become the dominant features of political discourse and political interaction, these are the kinds of warning signs that we need to really pay attention to, right? So when you have 40% of a population willing to vote for a person, like in my own country, who's not committed to playing by the rules of the game, that does not mean all of those people are anti-democrats, but it does mean that they are fed up enough with the alternative to be willing to accept some very dangerous moves on the part of the person they do vote for.
It's always a bit dangerous to ask questions about particular cultures. But we are going to tread carefully here by asking you whether you think there are some cultures in this world that come better predisposed to appreciating liberal democracy and democratic governance, as opposed to other cultures which may be more inclined to accept illiberal democracy.
I don't believe that is true at all, and I don't believe that there's actually really much good historical or comparative evidence for that. I teach courses on the development of democracy, and I always ask my students when we get to the end of the Second World War, if given what they know about German history up to that point, if they had to bet their retirement funds on Germany becoming a stable liberal democracy in 1945, would they have done so? I think that would have been a very bad bet to take. I'm also old enough to have taught classes on democracy during a period when discussion of Asian values, quote unquote, was really quite prominent, and the idea that Asian countries could never be democratic. And then we had remarkably successful transitions in places like Taiwan and South Korea. So no, I do not think cultures are more or less democratic. I think people need to learn, as I mentioned before, the democratic rules of the game. And I think often it just takes a significant amount of time and experience with the dictatorial alternatives for them to do so.
Well, those are great examples that you gave, but then others might point to the Middle East and say, here we are a decade after the Arab Spring, which sprung, and nothing happened. And the dreams are just as dashed today as they were 10 years ago. Is that a part of the world where culturally it's just not as on as in the other examples you gave?
Well, I think there's two great ways to look at that. One is just to start with some basic survey data. And if you look at survey data for the Arab world, you can see that people there just as much as people in other parts of the world embrace some basic goals, right? The desire for self-rule, the desire to be able to, again, choose their leaders and governments. The other thing I think we need to recognize is that the Arab Spring was really the first try at democracy for many of these countries, which are themselves young countries. They are the product of decolonization, not that long ago in the past. And that they failed at their first try at democracy should sadden but not surprise us. If we look back at European history, which of course is what my book is about, you can see that most European countries failed in their first try at democracy, even their second and sometimes even third tries, because, to get back to a theme that we have been discussing, it takes a lot to build up the institutional and normative infrastructure of democracy. So that the Arab Spring failed, just like the event in European history it is echoing, right? The 1848, the springtime of the peoples, should not again surprise, although it should sadden us.
All right, you suggest that the history suggests that we don't know of gradual, liberal, nonviolent paths to democracy. And yet, can I gently push back on that a little bit and say, I think I'm sitting in a country right now that has actually done just that?
So I would say that there are some cases that do approximate that model, and Canada might be a good one. But if we look at the classic cases that people point to in this regard, which are Britain and the United States, I don't think those hold up very well to historical scrutiny. The British case is an interesting one. Many people would date the beginning of its modern political development to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and yet we did not get universal suffrage in that country until the early 20th century. The United States, my own countrymen and women like to think of this country as always having been democratic. That is, of course, not true by any objective standards. It took the bloodiest war in our history, the Civil War, to extend, at least in theory, democratic rights to all citizens. And then it took another 100 years until the civil rights movement in the 1960s to actually bring at least the legal reality of equal political rights to our citizens. So I think it's very hard to find those cases of gradual, peaceful political development. But I will have to concede perhaps the Canadian case, but I don't think there are more than a handful of them.
Well, that's a great point that you just made, because when people talk about the American Republic, we often think in terms of a place that's more than 200 years old. And the fact of the matter is, as you've just pointed out, genuine American democracy, where it was in law, is a 5.5-decade-old phenomenon. And I wonder whether you think Trump's election signals the kind of birthing pains of a multiracial democracy that we don't necessarily think of as being that new a thing in the United States. What do you think?
I think that's an excellent way, in fact, to think about what is going on in the United States today. It is really only since the civil rights movement that we have been a full liberal democracy, according to any definition that would be used by social scientists, because up until then, again, a part of the country remained essentially an oligarchy. That is to say, in the South, African Americans were denied their political rights and the social and economic privileges that would go along with them. And so if we think about the fact that it's only been since then that we have really tried to turn our democracy into a democracy for all citizens, regardless of their background, regardless of their skin color, then many of the difficulties that we are dealing with today begin to make more sense, right? Turning us into a diverse liberal democracy. This is a very difficult thing, and we have been struggling with it, indeed, as you say, only for a number of decades rather than the centuries that Americans like to think of themselves as having lived in a full democracy.
And we look from north of the border with utter fascination at how you are doing this and facing these challenges. And I guess I do wonder how your liberal democracy, how it intends to deal with the reactionaries within it who prefer the past to the present or the future and fear that they will have no hand in shaping that future.
Well, this is another really great question. Historically, groups that are losing status and political power, they are resistant. That is simply normal and expected. Again, not normatively good, but what one could expect given the reality of the situation. What's crucial, of course, is to create positive rather than zero-sum games. Our politicians need to make people understand that incorporating new people and new groups into our democracy does not mean that they will suffer politically, socially, or economically, but that we can build a better democracy, a better economy, and a better society where everyone can prosper. If we let people think that democracy or the economy are zero-sum games, they will react accordingly by resenting and getting angry at the gains of other groups. And so it is incumbent upon democratic politicians to create policies and situations that enable us to see that we have something to gain from including fellow citizens in the American dream, rather than we can only win by excluding others.
As you see it, though, even if the Democratic Party did that, would the 74 million who voted for Trump be open to it anyway?
I think that you do not have to convince everybody that you are right, but what you do have to convince people of is that you are not dangerous. That is to say, democracy does not require all citizens agreeing. If all citizens agreed, in fact, democracy would be superfluous. What democracy cannot take are zero-sum games. What democracy cannot take is the sense that if the opposition comes to power, it is threatening or dangerous, right? So all the Democrats need to do, and I say all not meaning this is easy, right, is not, they don't have to convince everyone, but they do have to tamp down the temperature. They do need to tamp down the level of fear and resentment. And that is really what we have to look for over the next years in American society.
I think, Professor Berman, one of the things that makes doing that so difficult, and I've probably only heard this 1,000 times from progressive / big D Democrats over the last couple of years, is that I've heard it over and over and over again. How can these lower middle class and lower class people in the South, for example, how can they vote Republican? They're clearly voting against their own economic interests, which of course doesn't appreciate the fact that culture, not just economy, is a huge part of this debate. How do we get from A to B on that?
Well, I think that's also sort of a great question, right? Which is because people, whether they're lower class, whether they're middle class, whether they're upper class, have a variety of interests and goals they bring to the political arena, right? Economic, but also cultural or moral. And so we need to figure out ways, again, to tamp down the temperature. Personally, I think that debating certain kinds of cultural issues is very difficult for democracy. And so you don't want them to dominate political discussion, because if people feel like their values are being threatened, it becomes very difficult for them to focus on anything else, right? So if we want people in the South, let's say, as you mentioned, to focus on what parties and politicians are going to best serve their economic interests, we need to have them not focused on what they see as threats to their cultural or social interests. And I think that can be done. I mean, if you look at survey data on American politics, for instance, cultural issues have really jumped in importance over the last 10 or so years. That is to say, they have dominated political discussion. This is not necessarily the time when we've made the most progress on those things, but we are focusing on them more. I think that we perhaps want to flip the switch a little bit and focus on some other issues as well, which does not preclude making progress on some of these underlying social and cultural problems, but it does mean focusing not exclusively on them.
Let's play a clip here. This is Cornel West, whom you know, of course, philosopher, political activist, pondering what Plato said about democracy some 2,500 years ago. Sheldon, the clip if we could.
The founding text of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato's Republic, provides the most powerful indictment of not just democratic practices, but the possibility of democracy. And he argues that every democratic experiment, every experiment in which those Stone called everyday people attempt to govern themselves, will result in tyranny because there's too much unruly passion and pervasive ignorance among the demos, among everyday people. So we're still wrestling with Plato's challenge. Plato's challenge will never go away, will never go away, because the fascist possibilities of any democratic experiment are always there. I don't care which part of the world you're talking about.
I mean, he's presaging January 6th there and the insurrection on Capitol Hill, and whether or not democracy is always going to be in danger of being vulnerable to that. What do you think?
Well, I think, as we've discussed, democracy is always in danger. It is quite fragile. However, I have to push back against this sort of idea, if only because we really don't have a lot of good examples of dictatorships or oligarchies that rule in a much better fashion. That is to say, of dictatorships or oligarchies that do a better job of protecting the interests of the people rather than the interests of the rulers. So, you know, to quote Winston Churchill, perhaps against Plato, you know, 2 cheers for democracy, right? It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. Sure, people, just like elites, have a tendency towards ignorance and passion. What's crucial is to make sure that our politics does not prey on those things, does not aggravate those things, but tries to appeal to people's, again, you know, more rational and logical selves. But, you know, it's easy to piss on democracy. And, you know, again, given the state of democracy in my own country today, I am very prone to that particular tendency. But let's remember what the alternatives are and how much worse they actually are.
Well, one of the worst characteristics that too many Canadians have is that we're incredibly sanctimonious and smug as it relates to our moral authority in this world. And I might just point your attention to the Economist's Democracy Index, which came out not that long ago, in which Canada moved up a couple of spots. We're now 5th, and which America, I think, was 25th. And for a place that many of us grew up thinking of as supposedly the shining city on a hill, well, I'm curious, what was your reaction when you saw that you're 25th best democracy in the world?
Well, I study democracy, so this doesn't surprise me. The United States has been on a decline, and that decline accelerated greatly during the Trump administration. So the actual ranking doesn't surprise me, and in fact coincides with the assessment of experts in other organizations that look at the state of democracy. What this says, though, exactly as you indicate, is that we are very far from the self-image of the city on the hill that a lot of Americans would like to hold. We have a lot to do to correct the problems in our society, to correct the problems in our economy, and to correct the problems in our democracy. And I think we can, and I hope that the Biden administration is able to do so, because what happens in the United States, for better or worse, has a lot of implications outside of the United States for, again, the state of democracy in the world more generally, and peace and prosperity across the globe.
Well, you have led me very nicely to where I want to end up our conversation, because I want to read an excerpt from something you wrote. This is you in Dissent magazine in the winter of 2018, and here we go. As recent elections in the United States and Europe have made clear, the more people believe that political elites and institutions are unresponsive to them, the more likely they are to want to sideline or even eliminate them, continuing to allow wealthy individuals and special interests outsized influence on politics, or insulating political institutions and policymaking further from the people, is therefore likely to increase support for populism rather than diminish it. Oligarchy or technocracy and populism are not opposites, but evil political twins. The former seek to limit democracy to save liberalism. The latter seeks to limit liberalism to save democracy. Neither is wise, and they feed off and intensify the other. Well, I want you to, that's very well written, I have to say. Well done. And I guess I need you to sort of follow up on the last answer you gave, which is how much hope you do hold out that things are going to be different under Joe Biden and that his administration gets all this.
Well, this very nicely brings us full circle, because really underlying democracy is the idea that it is a political system that serves or is responsive to the people. And when people feel like politicians and parties are not responding to their demands, are not solving the challenges their societies face, they become dissatisfied. And as we discussed right at the beginning, therefore willing to potentially embrace even radical or extreme alternatives. If we want democracy to flourish in the United States or around the globe, we have to figure out a way to make our politicians, our parties, our democratic institutions more responsive to the problems that people face, to the challenges that societies face. That is the key to democratic success. It's the key to the success of any society. And our democratic institutions, certainly in the United States, by many, many measures, have become less responsive over the past decades. And I think Donald Trump is one indication of that. And so figuring out how to make democracy speak to the people, respond to the people's needs, that is another way of thinking about what Joe Biden's administration and American democracy has to do in the years going forward.
Hear, hear. Sherry Berman, professor of political science, Barnard College, New York City. Awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight. There's your book on the screen as well, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. We're so grateful for your time, and stay safe out there, okay?
My pleasure. You too.
We hope you'll join us for the next installment of the Democracy Agenda, which airs 2 weeks from tonight. And a reminder, you can check out my column today and every other Thursday in the Toronto Star. And that is the agenda for Thursday, February 18th, 2021. Tomorrow, Canada's Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, Catherine McKenna, talks to Nam Kiwanuka about the federal government's building and spending priorities. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Nam, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.